Good afternoon, one and all. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants panel roundtable discussion. We are excited to present all three of the panelists today have been on multiple times before, but not all at the same time. I have with me, of course, familiar faces, J.B. Shreve from some undisclosed bunker controlled by Walmart in Western Arkansas, and Blake Fisher of the Homeless Conservative, who ironically are almost completely equidistant from me. I'm in Tulsa. Blake is in Oklahoma City. JB is the opposite direction, but they're almost just about as close to where I am right now. JB, of course, is host of the aptly named The End of History, or JB Shreve in The End of History, I believe.
Yep.
And JB, I feel like I always get this wrong. It's a historical look through a Christian biblical worldview. Is that how you describe that?
Correct.
Okay. Great. And Blake, of course, is if the name isn't obvious enough, he is a fellow conservative, fellow traveler who is nevertheless a bit in the wilderness in our current political environment. You can Google The Homeless Conservative, Blake, and you can find his podcast there. Good to have you, Blake.
Thanks for having me.
And quite the opposite of these two gentlemen, on the other side of the planet, is Avi Wolf joining us.
I have returned to the States. So I'm now in Michigan.
Oh, you're in Michigan. Oh,
yep.
Awesome. I did not know this. Okay, so you're only like, what, an hour different than us?
Something like, yes.
Awesome. Like, when did this happen?
We made the decision. We flew back last week. My wife has some good career opportunities, hopefully in New York.
Awesome. Well, wonderful. Well, welcome back, I suppose, to the United States.
Yes.
You'll still be the person I defer to for all things Israeli news, probably for some time to come.
No problem.
Fair.
We are going to have a general conversation today around something. You guys, and in fact, I want to open the conversation this way. I want to talk about news consumption for the simple reason that I have a lot of friends invested in politics who have been for a long time. And many of them I have had on this panel discussion in the past before, who I've invited to certain discussions, in recent weeks or months, who basically said, Josh, I love your show and love what you're doing. I'm out. I'm not talking politics for the indefinite future, if you will, for my own sanity. And maybe that's just the circle I inhabit and run around in. I don't know. And maybe there's a little bit of a sampling error since there's only four of us and we probably have relatively similar political circles. But I am curious, first and foremost, if the three of you gentlemen believe that we're in an era in which you have recognized other people, maybe even yourselves, have found news more exhausting than what it had been even in recent years.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that I don't think your situation is unique, Josh. I think that there's a lot of people that feel that way because I feel like it's the same thing when I talk to people I know. And I think you can even tell I think there was a fatigue over the last 4 years anyway. I think COVID, I think like the first Trump administration that leads into COVID, that leads into the 4 years and this last election, I think it was just a whole lot. I mean, there was a lot. And I think the other problem was that there was a lot that wasn't really worth paying attention to. And yet the news and everyone screamed at us that we needed to pay attention to this stuff because it was life or death and whatever. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about all the other stuff that was ancillary to that. And yeah, I think that after the election, people were like, all right, I'm done for a little while. And especially with the fire hose of stuff that's been coming out of the first couple months of the Trump administration, it is one of those weird things where there's too much. Like no one's doing any kind of filtering of, hey, is this something that's going to matter tomorrow? Is this something that's going to matter a week from now? Is this something that's going to matter 30 days from now? And sometimes instead of like the news going, we really don't have enough information to report on this yet, they just do it anyway. And I think that that's part of the problem. And I think that some people get a kick out of paying attention to politics when it's like this, like the fringier elements and the people that like to be in filter bubbles and the people that like to be outraged, I think are really into this moment. At least on the right. I feel like the left, I don't really know what's going on there. It doesn't seem like there seems to be more exhaustion on the left, I think, than the right, honestly. Because at least on the right, there's some people that feel like, oh, we're kind of winning and whatever. But I just mean the general side of the Republicanism. Whereas Democrats, I feel like those are the friends that I feel like have really kind of gone like, what do we do? And I think you see Democrats in the House and the Senate kind of don't know what to do either. Some people are demanding they fight back, and it seems like there's enough of their constituency they believe that's telling them to just chill out, or at least I think everyone just feels exhausted, at least on the left. And if you're not hardcore in the MAGA crowd, I think everyone feels it. I mean, I feel it too. It's like I don't even know what to cover sometimes because I go, there's a lot going on here, and I'm trying to pick between what matters and what doesn't matter, but I'm gonna get that wrong sometimes. But it's easy sometimes because if Donald Trump says something, it doesn't mean we have to report on it. I think that's the thing that I wish more people would realize. Like, why don't you wait till some sort of action happens before you talk about it? Because it seems like it's part of the game plan.
And JB and Avi, I do want to get both of your takes on this exact question. But Blake, since you mentioned that, I had lunch with a friend the other day that was turned on to your podcast because he was listening to mine, and I think it was the one where you were a guest on mine. Said, "Oh, Blake, okay, that's interesting." And he likes to keep up with politics, and of course, you do that more than I don't really do the daily grind of here's what's going on in politics. You're much closer to that.
Yeah.
And he was following your show for a while. And I don't mean this as criticism because some people go this way, but I think when you started doing daily takes, he was like, I'm out. I like Blake. And I said, well, he's been gone for 2 weeks. He was on vacation, so you might as well plug back in because I think he's back to more of the long form. But it wasn't you. It was just this whole notion of news is daily consumption that just exhausted him.
Yeah. It's been tricky because I've been playing with stuff like that because I felt like when I was doing an hour-long thing a week, it was too hard to figure out what to cover in that hour with all that was going on. And so I was like, what if I do a little bit more daily thing? Plus, I wanted to highlight the things that I didn't think were worth thinking about, if that made sense. There's always something going on in the news where I just go, frankly, no one has enough information and everyone is speculating right now. But so don't pay attention to this. And like it might take 5 seconds to say that. And like I said, I wish more people did. I wish the news did a little bit more of that. Like, so far, we don't really think it's enough to give, especially once you start going to the opinion side of things, because that's mostly what I'm doing is like sort of like it's newsy, but it's more of like, here's the opinion. Here's why I think this matters. Here's what I think this is conservative. This isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we just don't know enough yet. And I feel like too many people are trying to get the hot take in or the cool opinion that'll get them hits or viral or whatever kind of thing. And they don't even have all of the basic information yet to be able to make that judgment call. Or they're going, well, if this happens, then I think this. And if this happens, I think, and it's like, okay, why don't we just wait till one of those 3 things happens before we try to speculate? And I can see why people are exhausted because I like keeping up with this stuff and it's been exhausting. So I imagine if you were just trying to be like a well-informed citizen and it was down your list of priorities of things to pay attention to, I can see why that in combination with a lot of people, if you're not really into one of those bubbles, you are hearing 2 things that can't possibly be true at the same time. And you're hearing one thing from one source and something from someone else. And you're like, okay, well, those 2 things cannot be true. And I don't have the energy to figure out which one's right or wrong. Right. And so I'm just going to stop paying attention to them. I think that's probably the bigger problem is that most media, and I'm talking all the media, this is not just Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, their problem, like solo YouTube channels, podcasts, all that stuff have gotten so into the weeds of audience capture and not telling their audience, not saying anything bad about what they think their audience might not want to hear bad things about, that it's essentially lying. If you leave out enough information, you're lying at some point. And some people are then also actually adding real lies to the mess. And so I think that most people just go like, I don't know who to believe because they can tell these facts are in conflict with each other and they can't both be true at the same time. But then who do I go to mediate this? Because those 2 sources are not generally talking to each other. It's not like we see a lot of situations where, I don't know, pick your right-wing person, your left-wing person. They're never talking to each other. They're just like, they might show a clip from someone else and then rant about it, but they're never actually getting in a debate with each other most of the time because neither one of them are actually good enough at doing it to be able to actually do that. And that's a shame. I think I don't love the whole Jon Stewart crapping on Crossfire or whatever back in the day, because I think that it was actually a good thing to have a Democrats and Republicans arguing with each other on television. Like I don't, that doesn't bother me. And, I think he took it. I think Jon Stewart's form of comedy news has done more to ruin the country than Crossfire did. That's my hot take on that.
Wasn't it Crossfire that produced Tucker Carlson?
Yeah. And that was, I think Tucker's a smart guy. I think he's lost his mind, but I think he is clearly a really smart guy, a really good writer. And like him, like that was interesting because it was 2 smart people talking at each other. It wasn't, does that make sense? Like I feel like we've just dumbed it down a lot now. And it's kind of most people are so into their filter bubble. And this used to be a thing that was only a problem on the left, because if you lived in California, you'd never met a Republican or something. You never actually heard these arguments and stuff. And I feel like conservatives were generally better at arguing with liberals, because they, you can't get away from that culture. It's in Hollywood, it's in news, it's in media, it's all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like conservatives for a long time were better at arguing debating with liberals than they were with us, because we could take those arguments. We'd heard them before. We had counterpoints to their points and stuff. And now I feel like on the left and the right, when I talk to anyone, and this is mostly on the right now, I notice, like, I'm guesting on a lot of podcasts right now, and someone will bring something up, I'm like, well, what about this? And they'll have never heard that fact. Like, I talked to the example I use all the time. I had a lady on that like thinks that January 6th was whatever. I mean, she thinks they were what did she call them? Like prisoners of war or something. I mean, something ridiculous. And I brought up, like, well, I mean, some people were wanting to be violent. They hung a gallows and said, hang Mike Pence. And she's like, she had never heard that. And it's because the news information, Breitbart doesn't put that on their homepage, and Gateway Pundit, and like, they don't put that stuff up. And so she'd never seen it. And I was like, well, that's your fault. You know what I mean? It's like, ignorance only takes you so far these days, because you have the same internet access I do.
Do you think there's degrees of terrible based on the form of media, like social media, television, print, things like that?
Just to interject, I think each form of media, it's not so much they're inherently worse or better. Sorry if my cat here is trying to interrupt. Here, excuse me. Now he's messing with the wires.
Yeah, no, you can't do that, cat.
So. Yeah. But I think each form of media has its own, I'm trying to think how to put this. I'm a huge fan of Scott Adams, the Dilbert comic strips. I'm not a big fan of his writing, and when they did the cartoon, like the actual animated cartoon, it was okay, but it just didn't fit. It was like that form or content only worked in a 3-panel kind of Sunday or weekday paper strip. And I think every form of media has its ideal, things it does well and things it does not. Obviously, social media has a greater tendency to create dumpster fires, but I've also seen really engaged, informed decisions or discussions and debates on social media. I'm not anti-social media. I think it's just a matter of we learn how to work within these tools. There are appropriate ways and inappropriate ways to engage in them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that they all have a dark side. I mean, social media's dark side is that everyone's talking to each other asynchronously and without, like, you just say things online that you wouldn't. I know so many people that I follow on social media that I go, you've never said anything like that in real life.
Right.
Like, I work with you. I know you. And that is not, like, that's a different person almost online than it is. And so social media can do that. Like, it can warp personalities. And I think it's done that bring up Tucker Carlson is a great example. It's like, what happened? Is this real? Because I know he's a smart guy. Does he really believe this stuff now? Is he just hawking it? Like, Candace Owens is similar. Like, she's gone on an anti-Semitic kind of deep end, kind of crazy. Like, and you go, okay, like, I don't know. At some point, I think you start it insincerely as like audience capture. And then I think at some point you start believing, like, it's hard to be cynical. I don't know. There's a weird thing there that happens. I think all of them end up morphing over time if you dive too far into the bad aspects of that thing. So the biggest problem with social media is the algorithm rewards outrage and fear, because that's what people reward on the algorithm. So that's been the downside to me for social media. But like, there's an upside of like podcasting. I feel like there's like these long form conversations that you can really get into the news and stuff, but not if two people get on a podcast and start riffing about stuff they don't really know about. So it's like, everything's a double-edged sword.
So I'd like to add to that, as someone who has used traditional media, social media, and who enjoys listening to a podcast from time to time. Every single form of media has its imperfections and its flaws, and also its advantages. The advantage of traditional forms of media, and when traditional forms of media, I don't mean I don't accept the hierarchy of like AP, Reuters, and everybody else. That's how it is in my business. I say they're all on the same level. Maybe we'll get to that another time. But their advantage is that when they do their job, sometimes they do their job, even if accidentally, they what they do is they almost always have sources who are high up in government or official or company circles who are willing to talk to them, often not out of altruism, but they still talk to them and they still provide useful information, reports, ideas, where a government wants to go, and so on and so forth. The flaws in it, the right latches on a lot to ideological bias, and it's definitely there. Although I think its nature is a little different than what people think it is. It's not like all reporters have like this ideological cheat sheet in front of them when they're deciding how to report news. It's more like if you're in any given circle, maybe I should give an example. If you're a fan of a sports team, right? You immediately, you're immediately a part of the team. You immediately assume that this team is off, this opponent's team is awful. This player has got to go. It's just common knowledge, right? It doesn't matter if you've ever actually looked at whether the player is awful or whether that coach has to go. It's just common knowledge. And when you're in that circle, you just get used to seeing certain terms used over and over again, right? To give an example, how reporters report on abortion, right? You may or may not have even thought about abortion, but everybody uses these terms, so that's how it is, right? So it's more like automatic unthinking, not even groupthink, more like these are the terms people use, well, I'm going to use them. But those are the advantages and the disadvantage. Another disadvantage is that, like I said, very few sources are altruistic. And a reporter is only as good as the sources they use. And very often sources, I've run into this a lot when it comes to reporting on Israel and when it comes to reporting on Middle East. Very rarely are sources trying to give you an unbiased, neutral assessment of the situation. Almost always they are using the reporter as a soundboard to try and manipulate how the government is doing something in one way or another. And I'm sure it's the same in the United States. That's another thing. And another thing is that reporters, even those who want to entirely tell the truth, are also hamstrung by their sources because they can't go against their sources and say my sources are exclusively establishment people in, say, the Defense Department, right? So I keep getting important information about them, and then I discover that the Defense Department really has some really big issues, and I want to report on corruption at the high levels, and the source says, I'm never talking to you again if you'll report on that. So this and the common knowledge problem are, I think, problems that whenever you consume media, right wing, left wing, you always need to take that into consideration. Social media is both a blessing and a curse because it is a small d democratization of media, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody can post, everybody can write about it. On the one hand, if you are good at culling your sources, if you are good at paying attention to who's smart and who really knows what they're talking about, you can get a lot out of it. You can hear from genuine experts, many of whom are still working in a particular field or did work in a particular field. And even if you don't agree with them, you'll often come away learning something. The problem, as you said, Blake, is that a lot of people only want to hear what they already believe in one way or another. They're not really interested in being informed. They just want to hear, I know so-and-so is bad because I'm a member of the team, so I want to find more evidence that so-and-so is bad. And it's kind of hard to break, or really hard to break through to such a person, right? Because even if it's on an ostensibly innocuous or innocent thing where you say, go to a pro-Trump person, Trump's great, but there's this problem and this problem. No, you must be 100% pro-Trump or you're an enemy or something. I think a lot of it has to do, the sources are out there, like you said, they're good sources, they're bad sources, but the temperamental issue of why you even want news. Do you want news in order to learn things, or do you want news in order to confirm what you already know?
Right.
You're gonna go to very different places depending on what you want.
Yeah.
And the same is true of podcasts. People who want to be informed by podcasts and YouTube channels, there are amazing channels out there.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff, but only if you want it. Only if you want it. If you don't want it, then no amount of proposing new sources is going to help. I think that's a very big part of the issue here.
Yeah, you nailed it. And I think that goes back to the monetization problem with all of these things, is that's all changed drastically over the last 20 years for sure. But I mean, even in the last 5 years, so much of that has changed. And so I think it's really important to understand where someone makes money from. And there's no perfect way to do it, because people think, newspapers, we were still paying for the subscription, and the advertisers were paying for the eyeballs that were in front of it. And so there's like in Oklahoma, just for an example, the local news, you will never, ever, ever, ever on the local news see a negative story about a tribe or a casino. And the reason why is because half of their advertising dollars come from those casinos. It'll never happen, because they would be biting the hand that feeds them. And you've got to understand that going into it. Like, you were just like, if you want an honest story about what's going on in the casinos in Oklahoma, you cannot go to the local broadcast. You will never get that story, because they're beholden to it to some degree. And that's why by the way, my total worry about sports being ruined in the future is that as we've opened up this betting kind of stuff, like, how is that ever? There's a perverse relationship there. If ESPN has a betting app and the TV station and the anchors, I mean, it's going to happen more and more and more, that you're going to see corruption, and it's going to be bad. And so you have to look at the motivations. And to me, it's very important to do that with YouTube, social media, podcasts, anything. How are they making their money? And if that's user-based, if there's subscription from users, well, yeah, they are sort of beholden to their audience, but they've also, it's like they got to keep up their end of the bargain. So there's no perfect way to do it. You can also have Jeff Bezos that owns the Washington Post, and some people think that's great. If you have some sort of billionaire that's willing to lose some money on a thing.
Or Elon Musk owning X.
Yeah, Elon Musk owning X. The point is, you've got to at least look at it through that lens sometimes, to be a little critical about stuff. Because the truth is, it is a business. That's the other truth. It's like, people are trying to make money at this, and trying to figure that out is tough, especially for like MSNBC and Fox and stuff like that. They're going to start seeing a precipitous drop in their viewership because it's so old, and you're going to start seeing that change because they have to pivot. You're seeing it with cable TV. You're seeing it with everything that's even not news right now. It's movies. It's everything. And so as that stuff changes, it's important to keep that in mind, because if someone makes a sudden shift, you feel like, wait a minute, where did this come out of? It's probably for money. And it's just being honest.
Years ago, we made a decision. We didn't realize it was such a big decision in our home at the time. This was in the early 2000s. Netflix is just coming out. We just decided we weren't going to get cable. And at the time, if you didn't have cable where we lived, you didn't really have TV. But there was so much coming in just through commercials and things like that. We had little kids, and it was like, we're going to skip on that just so we can manage the content that's coming into our home. So we did that, and it was a really good decision for us, because I kind of never developed an addiction to 24-hour news as far as television news is concerned, and that was back when Fox was really on the ascent during that time. And then, of course, social media comes along. And I was really into it for a while with social media. And I found, especially with Twitter, I would go in after a while, and it was before Elon took over, but it really amped up afterwards. But I would go into Twitter, and I would never come out thinking, man, that was a good hour of my time. I always came out thinking, I'm more anxious now. I didn't feel good when I went in there. And so I finally just deleted my account on that, just to make myself not go back anymore. But I have maintained since 2008. For me, that was when the polarization really started, from what I saw in the culture that I was living in. And I just decided, I want the people who I'm working with, I don't want them to have any clue who I'm voting for, because everybody's got an opinion, right? And that was a personal objective, to keep me from talking about it all the time at work. And in that, I find that people always assume you voted for their guy, and so they'll talk pretty liberally and openly. But in that, I did want to stay informed. And so most of my news intake is through reading. Now, most of it's online. I'm not getting a hard copy of the New York Times every day, but I have a subscription. I've got New York Times. I try to be pretty rounded, from not just left-right perspectives, but from global perspectives, from BBC to Al Jazeera to the Economic Times of India, things like that, trying to get what's actually going on in the world, because I want to be informed. I think we do have a responsibility to do that. And it added, to be real honest, to the peace quotient or peace dividend in my life as far as that goes, because I find when I step into it, like I'll go to work and Fox News is always on when I'm at work, and I have a hard time taking my eyes off it. Like I'll be looking at the screen, it's like, are you serious? They're really saying that? It's like, that's not true. I read something this morning that's not true, and it's I think what Blake said with the monetization, I think that's a big deal. This is always on truth. I don't even think it's always on facts. It is about stirring audiences, getting audiences engaged. You know, the old statistic about an emotionally charged tweet travels, I think, 28 times farther than one that's just a fact-based. You know, if there's anger attached to it, it's going to go a lot farther in social media. I think the same thing occurs in news, and that's not something I want to be honestly moved by. I'd rather have some facts on my side. I think there's good facts out there, but I think from a monetary position, most of the media outlets have to include that consideration because they've got to stir up some level of polarization. And I think the media is just as polarized now as, say, Trump is on the right. The left side of the media, like the New York Times, they're pushing buttons just as hard as they can to generate audience. And Hillary Clinton wrote an editorial. I say I'm not getting social media news from social media. I am on Pete Hegseth's WhatsApp channel. So anything I can get directly from the horse's mouth, I enjoy doing that. But outside of that, when Hillary Clinton wrote an editorial this week regarding that whole leak, or it wasn't even a leak, but it's like, really? Hillary Clinton's going to give advice on this? That seems highly polarized. And it is. And that was the point, because it's going to generate traffic, going to generate audience.
Yeah, and one point I'll make about that I've said this week 100 times, and I say often when there's a big story like this, is I don't want to hear it if you weren't calling out your side for doing the same thing several years ago. And I think that's one thing that you have to be, if you really want to be informed, and you're right, people have different motivations for wanting to pay attention to this stuff. I feel like the primary thing should be that you want to be informed. I mean, it should be. It isn't always, though. But if you want to be informed, you have to pay attention to people, whether that's TV or podcast or whatever, or writing. I agree. I think writing's the best because I think it's just the natural slowdown that has to happen to write long form stuff makes you less likely to miss stuff, I think, than getting on Twitter or hopping on social media really quick. But if you are only paying attention and they've never said anything bad about the guy you like, then that's not a reliable source for information, in my opinion, because none of these politicians are perfect. Neither party is perfect. No one is. I mean, my opinion of all of government is that we should be skeptical of people in power across the board. And I think the media's job is supposed to be to question them no matter what. And that just got lost along the way at some point, and they stopped doing it if that person was on their side. And that's happening on the right. It didn't used to. I feel like Fox News actually in the 90s was like, they lived up a little bit more to that fair and balanced thing, in the sense that they were going, we're coming up from the right, but no one else is. And so we're going to tell you things and they were telling things that other New York Times and the other places just weren't talking about because it was inconvenient to the narrative. And you can do that without lying, by the way. You can just not talk about something. You can omit something and not lie about it. But if by leaving out details, it's like lying. And so the point is,
after the election, I was, it's like, this is the fact that Trump finally got the majority of the vote and things like that. There was a lot of hoopla over the Project 25 at that time. Mm-hmm. And I was convinced this is evil, all this stuff, just based on what I was reading. And it's like, I'm going to read this thing and I'm going to do a podcast series on it for my audience. And so I went, printed it up, and I just started reading through it. And as I'm reading it, it's like, this isn't so bad. This is conservatism. This is 90% of this I can go right along with. What's the problem here? And I realized, now I don't like the way a lot of it's implemented, but I realized this isn't just having a different perspective is not the same as being evil, is not. And I realized I'd been duped a bit from what I had been reading, because from a liberal perspective, it is extreme, but from the conservative perspective, the last 8 years before Trump, or even parts under Biden, that was pretty extreme. And it's like, that doesn't mean that it's true. And some of these things, just because it's not your perspective, doesn't mean that it's necessarily evil or even wrong. It's a different perspective, and we got to be able to have the maturity to approach it from that position.
That is relatively common, I think, for those of us who are on the, broadly speaking, I'll call the Trump skeptical side of conservatism, is that, at least for me, it has opened a lot of doors where I have um, had deeper conversations with friends on the left. And it is kind of interesting that on occasion they misunderstand, because we both agree on this thing. Oh,
Yeah.
I just assumed you would also agree. It was like, well, no, I'm still a conservative. And granted, there's some people that have left conservatism, and providing they've done that, come by those views honestly. I understand that. Have embraced a more left of center due to changes in recent years. But I did want to ask. This is not a, and this is not a completely. This is not just my observation. I've seen others make this too, that, with the exception of social media, which I think is, sort of the wild card in the room, I do take seriously the preacher and Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new under the sun. A lot of the things we're talking about, arguing about, it turns out we've always been talking or arguing about. And I'm curious if what part of what we might be witnessing in terms of news consumption and output isn't so much odd and bizarre, but rather we grew up in the odd and bizarre era when news was far more nationalized and was necessarily catered in such a way that it had to be, you had to remove the fringes because you couldn't afford to alienate your audience, because it was the entire country we were talking to. I don't mean it was perfect. I mean, I think I think the reason we have what we have today is because of the overgrowth of sort of the media establishment's unified voice on something that often left the conservative voices out. It's something that Jonah Goldberg, the podcaster, says very often. New forms of media are almost always successfully used at first by conservatives and pornographers, because those are the two groups that are not allowed in, the existing media. So you got your blog, the internet, the podcast community, social
radio
media.
back in the 90s.
Radio, yes.
What started it in the 90s, yeah.
Perfect example. That's not where most of media is, and so these newcomers, that's what they do well at. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, because if you go back to like the founding era, it's not as if the people in Boston had immediate access to what Philadelphia or the Deep South was thinking through their newspapers. Eventually the information could kind of focus through. But I'm wondering, are we actually in normal times? This is sort of how things always are, and we just came out of the abnormal time.
Historically, I think yes. I think that if you look at the history of the American press prior to mid-20th century, most of the press was partisan or yellow, and they could be incredibly vicious about each other's sides, and people consumed them all over the country, whether in small towns or cities or anything in between. And they often came up with things which were, if not outright fabrications, then something close to. I think part of the problem, and I think a big part of the problem, at least how I feel, why people on the right are so angry with establishment media, or I guess I call them legacy media institutions of the 20th century, is that they promise not to be that.
Mm-hmm.
They promise to be fair.
Yeah.
They promise to be, if not entirely neutral and objective, then at least as close as reasonably possible. And somewhere along the line, certainly in the last 20 years, and probably before, people started noticing, no, they're basically pretending to be fair and objective while being just as blatantly partisan as the worst podcaster or the worst newspaper person.
They're just more talented at it. They work harder at it, at hiding the bias, but it's there. Yeah, absolutely.
They're much better at it. And it's also a chicken and egg question, because in the mid-20th century, you had what might be called a very broad consensus on a lot of issues. Most people agreed that certain core parts of the New Deal need to stay. Most people agreed that you fight communism. Most people agreed, I don't know if I would call it religious conservatism, but I guess a culturally conservative outlook on life, the importance of family, the importance of staying in school and staying not getting in trouble with the law, things like that. And even if you had 1960s counterculture, that was still a counterculture. The main culture said, go the straight and narrow path. I had a lot of fun reading Mark Moyar's second volume of Vietnam, where he talks about, we know all about the draft dodgers, but he tries to tell the story of all those people who actually went and served in Vietnam, and they sound very much in that vein. But I think that we can debate about when the starting point happened. I think that the end of the Cold War was a very big turning point.
For sure.
Consensus just started to fall apart. And people more and more and more, it's a slow process. It did not happen overnight. Just started realizing that they don't need unity, that they can fight, in a very divisive form. You'll notice how, for instance, my favorite example is from 1952 to 1992, most of the presidential elections were landslides or close to, showing a sign of very strong national consensus on core issues.
Yeah.
Right. Since 1992, nobody, not on the right, not on the left, has won anything close to something like George H.W. Bush's 40 plus states landslide.
Mhm.
I think that is the easiest example to use to just show how we're back in a state of flux. We're back in what was before the mid-century consensus, when everybody was virulently disagreeing about what America is, what America stands for. And I think that the media shapes that, but I think it also reflects it, honestly. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such strong audiences for such divisive things.
Well, and I think the Cold War is a good example, because we agreed that we needed to win the Cold War, right? Everyone agreed that was what we should do, but we had disagreements about how to do that.
Not everybody, but almost
Well, okay,
everybody.
but like let's say I don't know, 90 something. I mean,
Yeah, Bernie Sanders wasn't entirely.
yeah, but more but I mean more than the majority. I'm not talking about 50 something percent. I'm talking about like 80, 90% of the country felt like, and even it was Democrats and Republicans. It was not like we had disagreements about how to do that and what were the right ways to do it or the wrong ways. They had different fears. I think conservatives and liberals had different fears about like Cold War kind of stuff. But without that, post the Cold War, we have not had a thing that as a country, we all sort of agree a direction that we need to go on. And what's funny is that I think there are plenty of things that are still 80-20 issues, 70-30 issues. And the weird flip has been that it seems like Congress and government is not interested in talking about those things, because that 20 to 30% is such a loud part. And so the 80% aren't very loud. And so, I mean, like, I think I brought this up on this show before, but I heard an interview with Ben Sass, and when he got to the Senate, he kind of met with as many people as he could throughout government just to figure out, figure out the minutia of how it goes. And he was really surprised how many people he was talking to at the White House that were like, oh yeah, Congress won't do anything. They just want us to do everything, because they don't want that. Even on 80-20 issues, they don't want those 20% of people mad at them. Those are the people that primary them and kick them out of their seat. Most of these seats are totally safe from being taken over by the other party, but they're not safe by getting primaried. And the people who will primary you are in those 20 to 30% of the.
I should probably clarify here, Blake, because this was something else Jonah Goldberg said once, for the Marjorie Taylor Greene contingent out there. When we say 80-20, you pick the 80%. We're not talking about the 20%.
Yeah. And and there's a lot of things that are like that. And for whatever reason, it's like we're pretending those issues don't exist. And we're like, everything's the 50-50 issue. And honestly, I think abortion, you brought that up a little while ago. I think abortion is a perfect example of that, where everyone loved to talk about it because there was really nothing they could do about it for so long. And so it was a really easy thing to say, I'd love to do this, but I can't. I can't, it's hilarious to me that the Republican Party did not have any sort of game plan, even when the Dobbs decision got leaked. You know what I mean? It was like leaked. They had months of heads up that this is going to happen. And still didn't manage to have any kind of way. Here's how we're going to talk about it. Here's our game plan. Here's our no plan whatsoever, because it just proved that everything that came before it was just nonsense, talking to their base to rile them up. And the Democrats were doing the same thing. And so that's a perfect issue of where it's almost like when there's nothing to be done about something, people love to talk about it. And then the second the rubber has to meet the road, they're like, well, let's do a focus group. And I don't know, we're looking way too much at polls at that point. And I just think that but that's our fault for being in the 80% and not speaking up about it too. I kind of look at it like everything boils down to voters and citizens in this country. Mm-hmm. And I think most of us are letting that really quiet, call it 10 of the country, maybe. I mean, you look at like Twitter is another good example. The number of people on Twitter, if you look at the active users on Twitter as a percentage of the United States population, it's insane that we think that's the real world. And yet it becomes the thing that drives all this stuff. It's what's driving these politicians. I think Joe Biden was largely captured by some people on his staff that paid attention to Twitter. And it's not real world, but he thought it was because the people that worked for him were telling him it was the real world. And I think it cost him and the Democrats dearly for trying to pay attention to that. And so it works both ways. It's like we are also now, because it has been democratized and we have these voices on social media, we're doing the same thing as individuals that we get mad at the media for doing. It's like we are hyping up things that aren't really hyped up, and we are not talking about things that are actually more important. And that's distorting the people that are trying to tell us what we want to hear because they're looking at a small sample size.
You know, you talk about the Cold War. Just as you're saying that, it's making me think we had a common enemy, common fear, and that was the easiest way to steer people in a direction. And it was helpful from the U.S. perspective for a long time. And then after the end of the Cold War, in the absence of strong leadership, it just strikes me the fear turned towards each other. It's like that's our neighbor. That's why we've got a red states, blue states, 50-50, almost 50-50 split as far as it goes, depending on which election it is. But that's, again, it comes back to poor leadership. And I think a lot of times the media steps in and we think they're leading us in a direction. And really, it's just another voice in that polarization from what I see.
And that's gotten explicit now. I mean, Trump explicitly says, and the people around him explicitly say that the gravest threat to the United States is the left in the United States. They don't say it's China, it's not Iran, it's not terrorism, it's not any of the things that actually will threaten American lives. It's progressives. And look, I think progressives have crazy ideas, and I want to fight them on them. You know, but it's insane to think that and to be fair, the left has done that to the right too. It's like the FBI was looking at more parents of school age kids for anti-terrorism stuff than actual, it's just like, it's insane to me that we've gone down this path of assuming that the other side is evil instead of agree with each other.
I've given up on thinking either side is more crazy than the other, to be honest with you.
Oh yeah, no, it's like full on lunacy across the board.
Each side is totally capable of, you think that's crazy, here, hold my beer.
Yeah. On the extremes, definitely.
So let me ask then, because all three of you gentlemen are individuals who I would consider very informed on a. I mean, I'm sure there are days, Blake, you just got back from a couple of week vacation, so I'm sure there are times you check out, probably need to, but I wanted to ask, where do you go to stay informed? Like, is it a variety? What meetings do you consume? Or is it a variety? Are there some you find yourself going back to over and over? And I'll just very briefly for myself. And I do not consider myself to be as well informed on current events as any of you three. So I'm not trying to compare myself here. I have been very grateful for the Dispatch, both in written terms and its podcast, and that it's center right. I largely agree with most of what they say. I think the times that they've been the most wrong were about the results of elections and exactly why the country is feeling certain ways. So I don't think they get it right all the time, but I think they do genuinely strive to say things honestly. The website, I don't go to this too often, but I do like the website All Sides, which is essentially it takes an issue, a daily issue, and then tries to say, okay, here's, so far as we can tell, the left's perspective, the right's perspective. Not they themselves saying it, but they'll link to articles you can get from those medias that have a left or right of center bias. So it's the same issue, but you can read from the various sources what they would say about that same issue. And podcasts seem to be very helpful and informative. Although I will say, I have my capacity for consuming certain voices that I don't agree with can wax or wane depending on the subject and depending on who they are. I do listen to Charlie Kirk quite often. I just can't do it for long periods of time. But I do find his insights helpful because it helped put me in the frame of mind of those I don't ordinarily listen to. I have some podcasts, specifically the NatCons for National Conservatism. There's a number of left-wing podcasts. I really like the Know Your Enemy podcast. They used to do more historical things about conservatism. They're a little bit more current news now, but they are one of the co-hosts was an actual intellectual conservative who went very left. He's Bernie Sanders left in effect. And so he has a lot of that. He knows how to speak the language of conservatives while presenting a leftist view. Like I said, I don't agree with them often, obviously, but I think they approach things in good faith. I could go on. I don't want to just give a big list, but I want to give an opportunity for each of you three to kind of advice. If somebody's saying, hey, I want to stay informed, who are you listening to stay informed?
Saving Elephants podcast. All the time, every time.
Plug. Well, so I mean, I've got too many things. I would never suggest people read all the stuff that I read, because the same thing. It's like, I'm trying to, do this for a living, so it's a little different intake that I need to do. But I do like writing better, and I also just don't trust people that don't link out to 100 times in that article. I hate it when people cite stuff and then don't give us any kind of inkling where they got that information from. I just think that on the internet, that should be ubiquitous. If you're writing an article on New York Times, it's ridiculous that you can rattle off some sort of statistic and not link to the thing that you got the statistic from. And so I don't trust it when people send me articles all the time, specifically to the right of me. When I say to the right of me, I mean, they're more MAGA than I am, trying to prove me wrong. And I'll open it up and I'll be like, I'll just write them back. I'm not reading this. There's not a single hyperlink in this 7-minute read. So I don't believe it. I don't trust it. I think you have to show your work nowadays. I think it's an extra step, and I don't trust people that don't. And that might be harsh. I just feel like it's so easy to do. And I've also just found that I've found writers I like, and then I stick with them no matter where they go, because I don't feel like the gatekeeping that used to happen a little bit more is happening as much now. At organization levels, and in an organization like New York Times or Fox News or anyone can change wholly if you got rid of the entire staff, and then it's like basketball teams. It's like the Jerry Seinfeld thing. We're rooting for laundry. It's like none of these people were, and it's kind of like that sometimes if you just pay attention to a news like New York Times or something, because the staff you like could leave, the people, new people could come in at a place that you don't like before. But so I kind of follow around writers I like, but that's probably not super helpful to people. So a lot of times when people ask me who I pay attention to, I give them a list of names and then I go. So if you see them, they're going to be a guest on CNN, watch it. If, I think these people are good, smart, honest people. And I think that other key that I mentioned earlier, like they need to say something that you disagree with sometimes. I think that that's another thing, is that if you find yourself agreeing with someone all the time, probably means they are catering their content to fit a narrative that you like and keep you in the audience. And that's on us too, though, that we need to not bail the second someone says something we disagree with and threaten them with their livelihood because we don't like one of their opinions. So it's like, you need both sides. You need the consumers need to be good of media, and so do the people that are creating it.
So I'm much more from the hard news world, at least for the past year and a half. God help me. So I'm not a big fan of recommending any particular source. In my experience, different outlets, and like I said, I consider them roughly on a same playing, assuming that they all act professionally. So if someone were to ask me how do I stay informed, my answer would be less read these outlets. My answer would be follow the following guidelines whenever you want to be informed, so that you do not automatically find yourself into a doom loop of going way too left or way too right or becoming way too suspicious. Rule number one, whenever you see any news item, your first response should be maybe. Maybe it's true, okay? Because you don't know the source. Sometimes the event has just happened. I have run into many, many, many cases where there was a report of something and 5 minutes later or an hour later, it turned out it was not right or it was inaccurate or something like that. So always have a maybe attitude to news items, okay? If it turns out to be true, fine. Rant and rave about it, be angry about it, but let it percolate for at least 24 to 48 hours and then do what you want. That's number one. Number two, like you said, it is very important that news outlets cite their source. Now, again, like I said, there's no such thing as an impeccable source, so don't think that just because there's a source that's perfect. But it is important. I should add something here, and it's not something that's commonly known, that unfortunately news outlets are very, very dependent on search engines for revenue, especially Google. And from what I understand, and these are standing instructions that I have received, that any link out is we get penalized in the search engine. So it's not always because someone wants to not show their work. Although there are plenty of lazy people, I'm sure there are. But in many cases, they simply don't do that because, for whatever reason, the gods of Silicon Valley have decided that if you put links outside your site. And by the way, I've run into this. People complain about Elon, but it's true in Facebook. I've tried to put links to my podcast on LinkedIn. They won't let me do it. So it's lots of for whatever reason, people have decided that the interconnected part of the internet is just not a good thing, which I think is very silly. But it's worth taking on into consideration. So consider the source. And also, when it comes to mistrust, don't be too trusting and don't be too mistrusting. Because I find, and I'm sure all of you have seen, that when people arrive at a position of I don't trust anybody, they become gullible to follow anybody who claims they also don't trust anybody. It is far better to work hard, and there's no easy way to do this. It comes from a lifetime of just learning who roughly to trust, who roughly not to trust. I have a 3 strikes rule. Some people might have a different approach. But what you need to do is, through experience, decide who, based on the amount of stories I have learned from each of these outlets, who do I generally trust to try and tell the truth. And those are roughly the 3 rules I would give any news consumer, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. And they have served me well as a news editor, and I hope that they serve other people.
You know what else? I mean, like, I think those all apply, by the way, to stuff that's not news. I mean, like, so the whole like Make America Healthy Again stuff is insane that people are believing. Like, someone on social media will just tell them something about something they eat that has absolutely no basis in scientific fact whatsoever. Yeah. And I find people completely changing their entire lifestyle because of what someone told them without. I'm like, where's the data? Where's where's anything? So this is happening more and more. I feel like it's not just news. I feel like it's happening with health. It's happening with wellness. It's happening with, just all sorts of stuff. And that democratization, I think will end up being a good thing in the long run of social media and that kind of stuff. But I think we're definitely,
if it doesn't kill us in the short run,
right? Yeah, if we don't all, like,
blow ourselves up first,
drink bleach because some influencer told us to. In the meantime, I just think it's funny how much that's going on. There's like just very simply, very easy. And then the other thing I would add to that is if it seems crazy, it probably is not true. Like, if it seems wild and like that, wow, then it's probably not true. The one I found recently was a thing that went around that you eat a credit card's worth of plastic every day or something. I can't remember what they were saying. And it's just like, you look at the science behind it. There's just like, you'd have to eat. It was like, it's like, it would take 23,000 years to eat a credit card's worth of plastic. Not a whatever.
Is notorious for taking studies. And this is not even political. And because they want to get clicks. They want to
click,
right? So
eyeballs.
Taking what is often a careful, qualified study, they blow it out of proportion and turn it into something it's not. So you can't. While it's true that a lot of people on social media eat it up, I don't think we can absolve, unfortunately, many journalists on this point.
No, I don't think we can either, because they're the ones that put the little, that'll make a great headline and a picture. It'll be, it's like, it was the same image render. It was like chopsticks holding a credit card, and it was. I get it. Wow. But I mean, everyone picked it up, and it's just not true at all. And now the whole country thinks that that's true. And that happens all the time with information. I mean, or especially, you mentioned in the moment. I mean, remember the Boston Marathon bombing? And I mean, they put someone else's face on television and said it was the suspect, and it was not. They had it wrong. I mean, it was like, so this is, especially in the heat of the moment. Yeah, you got to step back and go like, this might be true, but
so JB, what from you, JB? What recommendations or guidelines would you say?
I'm open to just about any news sources, but if they start demonizing the other side, that's kind of a turnoff for me. So that's usually, if they do it more, once or twice, I get it. But if it's consistent, then I'm just going to turn it off. I was listening to one the other day, a podcast, and they just were really snarky. And I thought it was NPR, and they were really snarky towards the the way they were reacting, responding, speaking about Trump supporters. And I'm not a Trump supporter at all. I'm very much not a Trump supporter. But the way they were talking, it was just really rude. I guess that seems like a pathetic way of saying it, but they were just really rude about it. And then I realized this is from the makers of Pod Save America. It's like, oh,
weird.
This isn't what I
Weird.
thought.
They told me 2016 was going to be the last election we had. I remember that. So I mean, why did we?
Yeah. And so, if they're demonizing the other side, if they're making the other side, if the overriding focus seems to be to make the other guys look stupid, it's like I don't really want to be a part of that. I've got my go-tos as far as credibility goes, because they've built up a reputation for credibility. The Economist, New York Times, right now the Washington Post. You mentioned Bezos owning that. I'm hoping that doesn't get too wonky.
I think they're trying. I think you can tell the organizations they're trying.
And so those are kind of my go-tos, but I'll pull from a lot of different sources and people. When there's a major global event going on, like say when the war in Syria, when that was happening, there was specific people on Twitter that I would follow because I read something I liked, and it's like this lady here really knows what she's talking about, and she's plugged in. The same thing with people, folks in Ukraine, and I'll follow them specifically on that issue for a while. And that's kind of the way I go. But I don't want to be turning against people.
Well, and JB, that's a good point on. There's no excuse for not being able to find an expert in the thing you're looking into right now. There's just no excuse for it. They've got a blog, they've got a Twitter account, they're guests frequently on things like that. Yeah. I am very much into hearing from, like, I love Andy McCarthy at National Review because he was a prosecutor at the Southern District of New York for a long time. So like he knows the Department of Justice in and out. So that's the person I'm going to anytime there's anything dealing with the Department of Justice, because he knows the nuance, he knows how the statutes, he knows how courts have tended to interpret stuff. And like, you need that level of wonkiness when we get into the weeds of these kind of things. And it would be really stupid for me to think that some reporter that just interviewed Andy McCarthy is going to write a better thing than Andy McCarthy is going to do. And you can find that across the board. I like Tom Nichols at The Atlantic for Russia kind of stuff, because he's been a Russia expert. I mean, that's what he went to college, during the Cold War and stuff. So there are people that,
Tom Nichols, by the way, is the guy that, yes, listen to him on Russia. There's a lot of things I don't like to listen to him
I agree. I totally agree. There's things, just because you're an expert in one thing doesn't mean you're an expert in everything. And so just because someone's really good at knowing about one thing doesn't mean it's going to translate to something else. Scott Lincecum is at Cato Institute, and he's a really great, free market, how does trade work? It does really great explainers with graphs, and also he's at the Dispatch too. But these are people where I go, okay, economics and stuff, I like this person a lot. Law, I like this person a lot. I found that I kind of have some people in sort of niches of expertise, and maybe that's not something that the average person can do but like I said, it's a good idea to start paying attention to someone that you can lock onto for foreign policy or something.
And if it's producing anxiety in me, I want to pause. Like I did, getting off of Twitter. It's like,
yeah, I did the same thing.
Am I getting positive results from this application in my life? I get there's crazy dark stuff happening in the world today, and I want to be able to moderate my intake of that. And so if I'm being sucked in, I want to back away.
And I want to ask that question. Yes, Avi, you got something?
I think it's perfectly okay for people to tune out. I think that the last 8 years has shown us that increased mass engagement of everybody in the country does not necessarily lead to more civic or civil or informed discourse. If you feel that it's ruining your life or ruining your relationship with your family, I remain horrified by people who say they're going to cut off contact with their relatives or their friends, or they're going to divorce over Donald Trump or something. Like, are you insane?
Right.
Going to be gone in 4 years. What do you're not getting that time back.
Yeah, that's that. I agree. It's
absolutely okay to tune out and say, you know what, there are plenty of other people who can do the job to remain informed. I'm going to work on what I can do with my family, my friends, my work, or whatever hobbies it is. I think it is an entirely legitimate decision, just as it is a decision for people who want to be informed.
And Avi, I appreciate that's actually where I was wanting to go in a sense, because I have long said, I support anybody who wants to take a break from social media, not necessarily for political reasons, but obviously for political reasons. I think when you tune out is going to have to be an individual decision. Because we all have our own triggers, if you will. And I think we all have our own thresholds. I can consume a lot more news, and maybe maybe I'm deceiving myself. I hope not. I can consume a lot more than most of my peers can, and it doesn't seem to bother me the same way it does others. But I do have a limit. And Blake, I know I think it's the tagline of your podcast, Political Junkie, so that you don't, and I love the necessarily have to be.
Yeah.
You're trying to, hey, you've dived into all this, so you're gonna reduce it for the listener so that they don't have to spend their entire day studying this stuff. And I think it is important. Now that means we do have an obligation to recognize, okay, at what point do I tune out? At what point is this harming me in some? Because I think the reverse can also be true. And I want to be a little careful how I express this, but JB, this is similar to what you said earlier. We have a responsibility to be informed citizens. We do have some responsibility to stay engaged at some level, but I think there's a balance there. I think we're fallible creatures that have to be very cautious that we don't go too far on either side of that.
Yeah, it's really hard to balance though, because, and for me, it's not so much the amount of stuff, it's the tone of it. I'm with JB. I had to leave Twitter because I was angry every time I got on it. And I was like, well, I don't want to be like this. And I was also finding myself just completely not wanting to, I was finding myself wanting to cut people off because of the way they were on Twitter, but not because of the way they were in real life. And so I was just like, it's not worth any of that, because I'm not getting enough good out of it. It's like weighing the two, it's like I'm willing to put up with some discomfort or there is bad news and stuff, and it makes me sad, or maybe anxious isn't the right word, but there are really bad things happening that I think we need to solve, and I think we need to talk about. And I think they're not fun, but sometimes that's kind of our responsibility. But I think the medium is more detrimental to those kind of like anxiety inducing or fear inducing or outrage inducing, because they're generally trying to do so. And they are getting that reaction, which is what people want. There's a bunch of people that just want to troll. I mean, I think JD Vance is essentially it's like there's just trolling people all the time on that's what our vice president. I mean, to be fair, the vice president doesn't really do much, so I guess he's got time to troll people. But that's weird to me that he has so much time to be on Twitter. That's strange to me, because I feel like he should
or Donald Trump
on Truth. I mean, yeah, it is. It's kind of it's weird, but I don't know how to. Yeah, that's a personal thing, and for some people, like my wife, is just that threshold for her is a lot shorter than mine is, and she finds herself just deleting all the apps more often than I do, and then kind of slowly dipping her toes back in. So yeah, you've got to be able to measure that yourself. And you're right, you can just check out entirely if you want to. That's your right. I mean, we don't have compulsive voting. You don't have to vote in 4 years. It won't be the last election, despite, people are going to tell you in 2028 that that's going to be the most important election of your life too. It's not true. It never is. They're all just elections. It's just a job interview / job, review. It's a review and interview at the same time. That's all an election really is.
I think you also have to be on your guard against the word I would use is pride, because it builds those rigid positions. It builds that intolerance for the other side, those other sides' perspectives. I had a kind of a situation with the tariff issues. All this is coming up, and I'm watching all these guys in all of my training, all of my academic studies in college and things like that. It shows tariffs don't work. Like, not in the modern economy. They don't work like that. Not in a globally connected economy. It fails. It's going to do all sorts of untold damage. And I'm looking at this, and there's these smart guys getting behind it. Not guys that I agree with necessarily, but like people whose business it is to make money. People whose business it is to make the economy work. And it's like, well, am I missing something? Because at the end of the day, I'm not an expert on tariffs, and I'm basing my position on the opinion, on the experts out there, my understanding of the experts. And it's like, well, I don't think this is going to work, but I don't want to take too hard a stand on this, because at the end of the day, I'm just choosing which experts I believe. So if this is the way we're going, let's watch. And that sounds passive. I'm honestly not being passive there. I'm trying to engage from a mature, developed perspective and not let this bring harm on me and my home. I don't want my family to have fear or stress on what's going on in Washington, D.C., right?
Yeah, JB, as I say often, that I think in an era that we're in, and maybe it's always been this way, but in this era, it seems in particular, a person has to have two thoughts in mind to maintain integrity in their views. One being, it is good to have discernment and be able to look at certain people and say, that is wrong, that is not right. It is also equally necessary that we constantly have the mindset of, but for the grace of God, there go I.
Mhm.
People can be deceived. I can be deceived. And I'm more likely to be deceived the more convinced I am that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And I want to, I guess in that vein, I want to close the conversation with admittedly kind of a broad question, but I think it needs to be asked. We have been spending this entire time talking, I think, with a presumption that the individual is themselves wanting to consume media in a healthier way. Maybe because they're exhausted from it, maybe because they want to be informed. I think, Avi, you had made that statement. If you want to be informed, and then you gave us 3 pointers how we could do that. It's hard, and we maybe, or as humans, are never going to be perfectly informed, but if you want it, you can do it. That being said, we all know people in our lives that, whether they realize it or not, probably don't want to be informed, right? Their consumption of media is not, the purpose is not to be informed. And so I'm just curious, we can't change people truly, but what do you say to the individuals in your life? And maybe you say varying things depending on the depth of your relationship or how far gone they are, perhaps, who you perceive they don't want to be informed. What do you do to put perhaps a rock in their shoe to nudge them in the direction of that actually is important and would do you good?
That is a tough question. That is a very tough question. And I wish I had some easy solution. Often what I do is I explain how the disaster they think is going to happen is not necessarily a disaster, that these things have been before. Like Blake said, there have been elections before, there have been elections afterward, there have been crises before, there have been crises afterwards, there have been scandals before, there will be scandals afterward.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need to let your blood pressure spike like that over every single bad piece of news that happens. Just maybe not take it in stride, but take it as, this is part of life. The other thing I guess I would try and encourage people to do is what I said about tuning out. A lot of people today, and probably always have, but especially today, have turned politics into what I would call a combination personality religion. It is something which is absolutely vital to their sense of who they are, and they cannot conceive of the idea that it is simply politics. People negotiating over how best to govern the country in ways that usually don't affect you personally anyway. And I think that a healthier way to do that is not to say you should be informed or you should be balanced, because it's not going to work. You're basically saying you should try and compromise or threaten who your sense of self is. A better approach would be to try and nudge such people into seeking out alternative ways of telling themselves who they are. Alternative things that aren't politics, in which they can delve into and be enthusiastic about and be hyper vigilant about, but in a way that doesn't consume their life. I think that is, it's, if you will, if politics is a drug, you need to offer maybe a healthier form of drug, at least as a first step, rather than try and quote unquote reason with them and say, well, there's this way to be balanced, because they're not interested in the facts. They're interested in their sense of self. And that's where you need to direct many of these people. Some of it might succeed, some of it not succeed, but helping them reduce the importance of politics in their lives. That's how you get them to change, I think.
Well, to me, there's a huge difference between people that don't want to be informed and want to check out, and the people that are pretending to be informed while only narrowly focusing who they're paying attention to. Yeah. And those are the people that really bother me. The people that claim that they're the ones informed, but you're the fool for how could you, we're the fools for paying attention to these other people that are evil liars and stuff like that. And to me, the perfect example of that is that flat earthers exist. Only right now could as many people as are smart and educated and by all means should not believe that the earth is flat, but they believe everything that they see that tells them the earth is flat. They believe it without questioning it. Any evidence to the contrary, they write off as fake, or it's a hoax, or it's a conspiracy, or whatever. And we are doing that with, that's just the most extreme example where I go, it just makes my brain hurt how stupid you'd have to be to actually think that and I don't care. Like, I realize that's not nice to say. If you believe the earth is flat, I think you're an idiot. But you're willingly being an idiot because you are not looking, but we're doing that with politics, and we're doing that with everything, where we're basically tuning out anything that doesn't fit our narrative, because you're right, it's our identity. Politics has replaced religion for a lot of people. And Donald Trump is their new Jesus. And it's gross to me as a Christian. I hate it. I think it's the Christian nationalism stuff makes my blood boil, because it's nothing Christ-like about it at all. But like, you can't, I've just determined there is no reasoning with that group of people, and you shouldn't try. There's no, like, I'm just not going to have that conversation with someone, because I'm just going to go, this is going to go nowhere. I'm not going to convince you to abandon your identity as a flat earther or whatever it is, MAGA or far left progressive, or pick any of the people where they've replaced as religion. Like, I'm a junkie, but politics is by no means the most important things in my life. It's just not. Like, I can turn that knob off when I leave work and go hang out with my family. And I don't know how to solve the problem for the people that pretend they're informed and just like are in that super bubble. But for the people that actually just want to check out, I think I'm with you, Josh, and like, that's totally reasonable to me. And I think that I do hope that, I would hope that media and people will get better at not making that so bad. But I don't see the exit ramp for it. I don't know how we get better at that, but I hope it happens. But I don't know what the answer to it yet is.
I think one of the benefits that I'm grateful for in my life, as far as not being sucked into the polarization, is I feel like I can go, like, I don't call myself a Republican anymore. I don't call myself a Democrat. I'm fine with going either which way if it will produce effective results. If it will produce more justice in society, if it'll produce more equality, if it'll produce more dignity for people. I'm all for these things. Those are some core values that I have. And so, a lot of times it kind of fluctuates on the spectrum as far as politics go. But when I look out there and I see the polarization, I work with a guy who sits behind me who is a Christian nationalist. I'm not sure that he would identify with that, if he would acknowledge that, but he's definitely Christian nationalist. I work with another guy who is a very liberal, very leftist position. And neither one of them want to listen to anything that I have to say, to be real honest with you, on politics. And not that I'm going around preaching, talking about it all that much, but they fit that mold of what you're describing, Josh, where they already know the truth. We don't need the facts. We already know the truth, and so they're going forward with that. And I had to kind of step back and look, because I find myself, I would get frustrated with either one of them on different points. And when you look at this, I think this media conversation is significant, because I do believe the media, along with politics, it's partnering a double-headed snake where it's provoking so many people. And at the end of the day, those people, they feel like something important to them is being attacked. Something about their identity is being attacked. And so ultimately, I feel that I've felt an emphasis to have more compassion in my life. And with compassion, I mean, I try to look beyond their politics and look to the heart of that person, because ultimately I think that's what they're wanting, is someone to see who they really are, value who they really are. They think Trump's doing it on one side. They think AOC or whoever's doing it on the other side. And I don't think any of the politicians are doing it, to be honest with you.
No.
I think that system is set up to fail as far as all that goes. But I can communicate compassion. I can communicate respect for those people. And getting the politics almost provides like a blur, a haze over the screen of seeing that individual. And so I try to, I hear what they say and go beyond that. And then, how's your kids doing? How's your family doing? And ask more questions about the quality of their life, and appreciate who they are, because both of the guys that I'm talking about from work, they're good guys. They're good fathers, they're good husbands. They want to do right in their home. They're not coming from a bad motive position. And so that priority of compassion, I think, sticks out pretty loud right now. I remember I thought George W. Bush was the worst president in the history of America by 2006. And then at the 2024 inauguration, it's like, man, I miss Bush.
Yeah. Isn't that funny how that goes?
Yeah, compassionate conservatism, his thing. It's like that was something I really appreciated. I really valued back then because that speaks something to my value system. And so it can't just be when my guys are in power. If it's real, I've got to embrace that, in season, out of season, as far as all that goes. So I try to maintain a posture of compassionate conservatism.
And that's what goes back to my point of saying I think that's majority of people is like, look how many people are leaving both parties to become independents. And I don't really think they're truly like in the middle or independent. I think they're rejecting the extremes that the Democrats and Republicans as parties have embraced. I think they're still probably voting mostly the same way they did a few years ago. But this past year was the first year more independents voted than Democrats in the election. That's going to be a trend that's going to be interesting to watch because I think that most people feel exhausted by this stuff. I think that you are in the majority if you're like, this feels overwhelming. I think that's clearly what most of the country feels like. And, if a leader can figure out how to talk to those people, I think things can change. Right now, it doesn't seem like anyone is actually interested in talking to those people, though.
That is the phrase, the exhausted majority, I think encapsulates it
Yes.
very well. I have hopefully something we've said in this conversation has been of some help for those of you who feel exhausted. Thank you for everyone who was watching and will be watching in the days ahead. Thank you especially to JB, Avi, Blake. I have profited greatly from the insights on each of your respective shows and the conversations we've had. So it's always good to have you on the panel. And we will see you guys next time.